Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
So I want you to imagine a Venn diagram,
Yeah.
right? On one side, you have high society glitz and glamour.
Okay.
On another side, you have, like, elite legal expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the third side, you have just straight up cold-blooded murder.
That's a pretty terrifying overlap.
Right, but that's exactly where we're living today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a case where a California judge did something back in 2020 that basically shocked the entire true crime world.
Yeah, I mean, the court threw out the murder convictions of this entire crew of guys who had brutally killed an elderly Palm Springs socialite.
And they were caught completely dead to rights.
Oh, absolutely. The evidence was just a mountain. I mean, investigators had a physical thumbprint tying them to forged documents.
Right, and didn't they have, like, thousands of text messages, too?
Yeah, exactly. 32,000 text messages, just
Yeah.
explicitly mapping out the heist, the murder, everything.
So you have to ask, why were they set free? Well, because the state gave one of the killers a MacBook.
It really is a phenomenal paradox. And our mission today is to unpack this whole just incredibly twisted 15-year legal saga.
Yeah, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources today. Dateline transcripts, sprawling appellate court records, state bar association documents.
But the most fascinating part of this story isn't actually the guys who committed the physical violence. It's the architect behind them.
Right, the guy pulling the strings,
Yeah.
David Replogle.
Exactly. He was a seasoned, highly respected litigation attorney based out of San Francisco.
Which is wild. I mean, this is a man who spent decades building a legitimate law practice, right? Navigating complex civil litigation.
Yeah.
And yet he chose to use all that intimate knowledge to work both sides of the law.
Which is exactly what makes him the linchpin here. Because, I mean, you can assemble a crew of charismatic grifters, right? But if you want to pull off a massive modern financial heist...
Like stealing entire states without tripping alarm.
Right. You need someone who knows how to pick the legal locks. And Replogle held the keys.
I want to start by looking at how a respected lawyer even gets to that point. Because, I mean, you don't just wake up one Tuesday and decide to orchestrate a murder-for-profit scheme.
No, definitely not. There's always a learning curve.
Right. So to understand the murder that eventually made national headlines, we really have to look at the dry run, like the proof of concept.
And that takes us back to 2002, because crimes of this magnitude, especially white-collar crimes that escalate to violence, they just rarely happen in a vacuum.
Right, there's a warm-up.
Yeah. And for David Replogle and this young, incredibly charismatic con artist named Danny Garcia, that learning curve involved a wealthy San Francisco financier named Thomas White.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. It's 2002. Replogle is a practicing attorney.
Right. And he files a civil lawsuit on behalf of two young men, and one of those men is Danny Garcia.
And they sue Thomas White for some pretty horrific sexual abuse allegations, right?
They do. Now, Thomas White vehemently denied these charges from the absolute second they were filed. He didn't just say he was innocent. He claimed this was a completely fabricated, highly orchestrated shakedown.
A shakedown. But, I mean, we have to look at how the civil legal system actually works in these situations.
Exactly. When you're dealing with explosive, reputation-destroying allegations, the actual truth sometimes matters less than the exposure.
Right, because just fighting that in a public courtroom could completely destroy a financier's career, even if they win the case.
For sure. Often, paying to just make it go away is really the only viable business decision, which is exactly what White does.
He settles the civil case for, what, $500,000?
Yes, $500,000. But, and here's the thing, he doesn't stay quiet about it. White later ends up in a Mexican jail facing very similar charges, and he's just screaming from the rooftops that Replogle and Garcia are running a sophisticated international extortion ring.
Wait, like going to other countries to set this up?
Yeah. White claims these two are literally going down to places like Puerto Vallarta, finding vulnerable young boys, plying them with drugs and alcohol, and paying them to fabricate stories about wealthy targets.
Oh, wow. And for the longest time, the general consensus was just that White was a guilty guy making up excuses.
Right. But the sources reveal this massive twist. In 2013, Mexican authorities actually validate White's claims.
They validate them.
Yeah. They formally charged David Replogle and Danny Garcia with extortion, basically confirming that White's theory of this highly organized shakedown ring was true all along.
That is insane. But the timing is the tragic part, isn't it?
It is, because by the time those extortion charges came down in 2013, Thomas White had already died in that Mexican jail.
Oh, man. And Replogle and Garcia?
They were completely out of reach. They were already locked up in California for something far, far worse.
You know, it strikes me that Replogle's approach here, it's almost like a twisted version of a corporate raider.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think about it. You have a corporate raider who finds a legal loophole or a vulnerability in a company structure, and they exploit it to liquidate the business for cash.
Right.
Replogle was doing the exact same thing, but instead of liquidating struggling companies, he and Garcia were systematically liquidating wealthy, vulnerable, older men.
Wow.
They found a flaw in the justice system, the sheer terror of a public trial, and they weaponized it for a $500,000 payday.
That is a perfect analogy. And we have to consider what a $500,000 payday teaches a young, ambitious grifter like Danny Garcia.
It's an incredibly dangerous proof of concept.
Exactly. It teaches him that the legal system isn't a barrier, it's a tool. If you have the right lawyer drafting the right documents, the system is easily manipulated.
It totally emboldens them. They realize a massive payout doesn't require hard work. It just requires finding the right target and applying pressure.
And that brings us to the perfect mark. Because once you split $500,000, the money goes fast and the egos get big. They needed a new target.
Right. So fast forward to early 2008 in Palm Springs, California. Enter a man named Cliff Lambert.
Yeah. And if you look at the profile of Cliff Lambert in the case files, he is just a deeply tragic figure. He was 74 years old, a retired art dealer living in Palm Springs.
And from the outside, he meticulously projected this image of just extreme wealth. Right?
Oh, heavily. He drove a pristine Rolls-Royce, lived in a sprawling, gorgeous, mid-century modern estate, and he would constantly name-drop celebrities.
Like who?
Oh, he'd tell people he was close friends with Lucille Ball and the Gabor sisters. He had a lavish story for, every piece of antique silver and every painting in his house.
But the financial forensics tell a completely different story.
An entirely different story. The reality was that Cliff Lambert was nearly broke.
Really?
Yeah, that multi-million-dollar art collection he boasted about, it was mostly cheap reproductions and fakes. Investigators later found he had maybe $18,000 left in the bank.
Wow. So he was projecting this massive $68 million facade, not to scam people out of money, but because he was just incredibly isolated and lonely.
Exactly. And if you're a predator, loneliness is the exact vulnerability you are scanning for. Lambert was using online dating sites to try and meet younger men for companionship.
And in early 2008, his profile matches with Danny Garcia.
It's a classic digital honey trap. Garcia plays the part, and Lambert is so thrilled by the attention that he actually flies Garcia out to Palm Springs.
But the reality of the date falls apart pretty quickly, right?
Oh, almost immediately. Once Garcia is in the house, he starts aggressively pressuring Lambert for money. He gets his hands on Lambert's credit card and misuses it.
And Lambert actually stands up for himself here.
He does. To his credit, Lambert realizes what is happening and actually kicks Garcia out of his house.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the psychology here. Because Garcia is a con artist. Usually if a con doesn't work out, they just move on to the next mark, right?
Right, but Garcia doesn't do that.
Why not?
Because for a narcissist like Danny Garcia, being rejected by an elderly man he viewed as just an easy mark, it's a massive blow to his ego.
Ah, so it's a narcissistic injury.
Exactly. The rejection acts as a trigger. It pivots the situation from a standard con to something deeply vindictive. It's not just about extracting money anymore.
It's about taking everything Lambert has, because Lambert dared to say no.
Yes. That rejection is what sparks the deadly plot.
So Garcia realizes he can't manipulate Cliff the old-fashioned way, so he decides to literally steal his life. But to do that, he needs a crew.
Right. So he starts recruiting, and the group he puts together is bizarre. He brings back his lawyer, David Replogle. Naturally. And then he recruits a close friend named Kaushal Narula, who is an incredibly brazen fraudster who literally walked around high society pretending to be an exiled prince from Nepal.
A fake prince. Okay. Yeah.
Then they need physical muscle. So they find a bartender from San Francisco named Miguel Bustamante and an ex-Marine named Craig McCarthy.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because this is the piece that I just kept getting stuck on while reading these sources.
The lawyer.
Yes. I understand Garcia and the fake prince doing this. They're career criminals. But Replogle is a legitimate practicing attorney. Why does a guy who already knows how to make money legally, who has a comfortable life, risk everything to become the architect of a murder-for-profit scheme? Is it just pure greed?
I mean, greed is the engine, certainly. But the psychology that allows it to happen comes down to distance and paperwork.
Distance, like physical distance.
Yeah, and emotional distance. Replogle wasn't the guy who was going to hold the knife. He wasn't the muscle breaking into the house. In his own mind, he could compartmentalize his actions.
Right, he could tell himself he's just doing his normal day job.
Exactly. He's just drafting durable powers of attorney, finding loopholes in estate law, moving assets. When a white-collar professional can separate the physical violence from the clinical paperwork, it becomes terrifyingly easy to justify.
They just view the entire scheme as a complex financial transaction.
Deliberately ignoring the human tragedy at the center of it.
But the crucial thing is, without Replogle, none of this works. You can break into a man's house and kill him, but you can't just walk into a bank the next day and say, "Give me his money."
No, you can't. The modern financial system has safeguards. To steal a house and empty investment accounts, you need the legal authority to bypass the bank's security protocols.
Which is where the lawyer comes in.
Right. Replogle was the architect who knew exactly how to forge those power of attorney documents. If you think of Lambert's estate as a vault, Replogle was the guy who knew how to manufacture the key.
Wow. So the crew starts what they arrogantly call Operation CL, standing for Cliff Lambert. And the text messages show they treated this like a game, right?
Oh, entirely. They're texting each other constant updates, talking in spy codes. But reality is so much messier than a Hollywood script.
Significantly messier. So the plan goes into motion on December 5, 2008.
Right. Narula, the fake prince, puts on a suit and plays the role of a posh British attorney. He manages to get Cliff Lambert out of the house and takes him to a nice dinner.
And during dinner, Narula spins this incredibly elaborate lie. He tells Cliff that an old, wealthy friend of his has passed away and secretly left Cliff a $200 million art collection.
Which is the absolute perfect bait.
Right. You have a guy who is desperate to be seen as a major player in the elite art world, and you tell him he's just inherited a $200 million collection. He is completely captivated.
It's a masterclass in distraction. And while Cliff is mesmerized at the restaurant, Bustamante and McCarthy use the opening to sneak into Cliff's house.
And when Cliff finally gets home that night and walks into his kitchen, they ambush him.
They do. They fatally stab him right there on his own kitchen floor.
Ugh. It's just a brutal, terrifying end for an incredibly lonely man.
It really is.
And immediately after the murder, the crew just shifts into this cold, calculated cleanup mode. They scrub the kitchen so thoroughly that when crime scene investigators eventually examine the house, they find almost zero physical evidence.
Nothing. They wrap Cliff's body in bedding, shove him into the trunk of his own Mercedes, and drive out into the Mojave Desert.
Where they dump his body near a runaway truck ramp off Interstate 5.
And we should note that it would be over a decade before a skull and jawbone were finally found in that desert and positively identified via DNA as Cliff Lambert.
A full decade.
Yeah. So because of that, for a very long time, prosecutors were forced to build a nobody murder case, which is notoriously one of the most difficult things to do in the criminal justice system.
But while the physical evidence of the murder is hidden in the desert, the financial theft is happening in wide open daylight.
This is where Replogle steps up to the plate.
Yeah, he literally assumes Cliff Lambert's identity. He walks into banking institutions, uses forged IDs, and successfully wires $185,000 straight out of Cliff's accounts.
And then he immediately tries to enact a fire sale on Cliff's Palm Springs mansion, trying to liquidate the real estate for quick cash.
This is where we see the absolute blinding arrogance of the white-collar criminal. They fundamentally believe they are the smartest guys in the room.
Right. So Replogle creates these durable power of attorney documents, which basically give one of their associates complete legal control over Lambert's entire estate.
But to make those documents accepted by a title company or a bank, they have to be notarized.
Exactly. Let's talk about how notarization actually works, especially in a state like California, because it's not just a rubber stamp.
No. When you go to a notary for a major financial document, you don't just sign a book.
Right. A notary public acts as an impartial witness for the state. Their job is to verify identity. In California, for documents involving real estate or power of attorney, the law requires you to leave a physical, inkless thumbprint in the notary's sequential journal.
A thumbprint.
Yes. That journal is designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of real estate and identity theft. It creates an undeniable physical chain of biometric evidence.
And this is the fatal flaw that brings the whole thing down. Replogle, in his desperate rush to steal the house and get the paperwork pushed through, actually leaves his own physical thumbprint in the notary's book.
Right next to Cliff Lambert's forged signature.
It is an astonishing unforced error.
Oh, completely.
It's the ultimate hubris. You have a seasoned lawyer who knows the law intimately, who has spent his career outsmarting opposing counsel, and he gets tripped up by the most basic, elemental legal safeguard in existence, a thumbprint pad.
And the sources show he realizes his mistake almost immediately. He walks out of that office and the panic just sets in.
Like that.
He knows exactly what that thumbprint means. It's a permanent physical tie connecting him directly to major felonies.
And doesn't he try to go back?
Yes. The records indicate that Replogle actually went back to the notary's office later and tried to physically steal the journal to destroy the evidence. But he fails. He can't get it. And that single thumbprint becomes the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's entire case against him.
So if we look at the board here, investigators have a physical thumbprint tying the lawyer to the forged documents. They have a massive paper trail of wire transfers. And when they arrest Danny Garcia, they crack his iPhone.
And find the texts.
32,000 text messages detailing every step of Operation CL. For most people, you look at that and say, this is an open and shut case. The police swoop in, they make the arrests, and they throw away the key.
It seems like a slam dunk. But this is where the story shifts drastically. It stops being a true crime heist and turns into a grueling 15-year legal circus.
Okay.
Because you have to remember who the system is dealing with. These men, especially Garcia, Narula, and Replogle, understood the machinery of the criminal justice system, and they knew how to manipulate the appeals process just as effectively as they had manipulated their victims.
Right, so let's track that timeline. By 2010 and 2011, the initial trials happen. The evidence is presented, it's overwhelming, and Replogle, Garcia, Bustamante, they're all convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
But that is nowhere near the end of the story.
Not even close. The defendants spend the next decade relentlessly filing appeals. They're looking for any procedural crack in the foundation of the trial.
And incredibly, they find one. In 2020, an appellate court actually threw out the murder convictions for Garcia, Narula, and eventually Replogle and Bustamante.
They vacated the sentences and granted them all retrials. I remember reading that and having to reread it. How does a conviction built on a physical thumbprint and 32,000 text messages get completely overturned?
It comes down to a concept called judicial misconduct. During the original trial, Garcia and Narula insisted on representing themselves. In legal terms, this is called acting pro se.
Which, for a normal person, representing yourself in a murder trial is a terrible idea.
Horrible idea. But for them, it was a strategy.
It was a weapon.
Exactly. Acting pro se gives a defendant direct access to the courtroom floor. It's a classic chaos tactic. They bombarded the court with 128 pretrial motions.
128 motions.
If you think about it in tech terms, it was like a legal DDoS attack. They were flooding the court servers with so much junk data and procedural noise that they were hoping the system would eventually glitch or crash.
And it worked.
It did. To help Garcia manage what's called digital discovery, which is basically the mountains of electronic files, police reports, and evidence he was legally entitled to review, the trial judge allowed him to have a MacBook in the courtroom.
Let me get this straight. The state gives Garcia a MacBook out of fairness, so he can review his files.
Right.
And he uses it to sabotage the trial.
Yes. Garcia, who was very tech-savvy, realized the MacBook's microphone could still operate. He used it to illegally and secretly record conversations happening at the judge's bench when court wasn't officially in session.
That is wild.
And on one of those secret recordings, he caught the trial judge talking privately to his clerk.
What did the judge say?
The judge made a highly derogatory, heavily biased comment about Narula. Narula was openly gay and HIV positive. The judge was complaining about the sheer volume of motions Narula was submitting from his jail cell. And the judge essentially said he was afraid to touch the envelopes because Narula was licking them to seal them, saying, "Lord knows where his tongue has been."
Wow. That is a blatant display of prejudice from the person who is supposed to be the impartial referee of the trial.
And that is exactly why the appellate courts had no choice. It didn't matter that the evidence of their guilt was staggering. The foundation of a fair trial requires an impartial judge.
Right. Once that recording proved the judge harbored deep bias, the integrity of the entire trial was fundamentally broken.
The convictions had to be vacated. It's a concept of weaponized due process. The defendants used the very rules designed to protect the innocent to blow up their own guilty verdicts.
I can't even fathom what that must have been like for the original prosecutor, Lisa DeMaria. The sources detail how much she sacrificed for this case.
She went through a lot.
She received death threats from the defendants. She was literally sued by them right in front of the jury as an intimidation tactic. She poured years of her life into getting those convictions, only to have the entire board wiped clean because of one off-the-cuff bias comment by a judge.
It highlights a massive inherent vulnerability in our justice system. The law is strictly designed to protect a defendant's right to a fair trial, which is, a vital cornerstone of a free society.
Of course.
But when those rigid protections are placed in the hands of highly sophisticated sociopathic con artists, those same rules can be used to bleed the system dry and delay justice for over a decade.
So the board is wiped clean, and we enter the era of the retrials starting around 2020. And the chaos only amplifies. We're in the middle of the pandemic, so the courts are constantly losing jurors to COVID-19.
They're constantly one sick juror away from declaring mistrials.
And then, in September 2022, right before he's supposed to face his retrial, Kushal Narula, the fake prince, is beaten to death by his own cellmate in the Riverside County Jail.
Which is a violent end to a violent life. But incredibly, Danny Garcia immediately tried to use his friend's murder to his legal advantage.
How so?
Well, with Narula dead and unable to testify, Garcia's defense strategy in his retrial was to simply point the finger at the dead guy.
Oh, convenient.
Very. He claimed Narula was the sole mastermind who orchestrated the entire heist and murder, and that Garcia was just a naive bystander who had no idea what was happening.
But the jury didn't buy that narrative for a second, did they?
Not at all. The 32,000 text messages were just too damning. They clearly showed Garcia directing the flow of the crime.
So in the end, justice was severely delayed, but it wasn't denied. After 15 grueling years, Danny Garcia and Miguel Bustamante are convicted again and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Which brings us to the final chapter for the legal architect.
Yeah.
In August 2022, David Replogle faced his own retrial. The prosecution methodically laid out the entire timeline, how he used his credentials as a licensed attorney to forge the power of attorney, how he bypassed the banks to steal the cash, and how he attempted to liquidate the Palm Springs estate while Lambert's body was dumped in the desert.
And Replogle tried to play the victim, right?
He did. He took the stand and claimed he acted under severe duress, that the rest of the crew threatened his life if he didn't do the paperwork.
But the jury saw right through the compartmentalization. He was convicted of 8 felonies, including first-degree murder, with a special circumstance of murder for financial gain.
And finally, in July 2025, at 76 years old, the disbarred San Francisco lawyer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars in a California state prison.
It is an absolutely staggering story. And I think the reason this matters, the reason we spent the time dissecting the mechanics of it today, is because it exposes the terrifying vulnerabilities within the everyday systems we rely on.
Yeah, for sure.
If you've ever bought a house or signed a will or set up a trust, you know how much implicit faith we put into a notary's stamp and a lawyer's signature. We trust them as the ultimate guardrails of society.
And Replogle knew exactly how much power those pieces of paper held, and he turned them into weapons. It also exposes the profound, quiet dangers of isolation.
Yeah.
Cliff Lambert's true vulnerability wasn't his fake art collection or his empty bank accounts. It was his extreme loneliness. This case is a dark reminder of how easily trust, legal authority, and the simple human desire for companionship can be exploited by people who know exactly which strings to pull.
It really makes you pause and look differently at the legal machinery working quietly around us every single day. Which leads me to a final lingering thought for you to ponder long after we finish today.
What's that?
Think back to the very beginning. Think back to 2002. If David Replogle and Danny Garcia hadn't succeeded so easily in using the threat of a public lawsuit to extort $500,000 from Thomas White, if the system hadn't rewarded their initial bad behavior, would Cliff Lambert still be alive today?
That's a heavy question.
It really makes you wonder, how many other standard legal settlements happening right now, quietly behind closed doors, are actually just sophisticated extortions hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right moment to escalate? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.